We are in 2020. We have schools and all new technology. We have conquered through many barriers leading up to now, and one important barrier that was broken is school segregation. Segregation is defined as the enforced separation of different racial groups in a country, community, or establishment. That means people who look different than you will have to go to different churches, schools, and even bathrooms. But this segregation did not happen a million years ago. This happened more recently. Segregation in schools happened less than 150 years ago. Segregation started out with the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws set rules that made it harder for African Americans to do things in life. The Jim Crow laws were made in the 1950s. These laws made schools separated by the color of people's skin. Many things that were separated were also not equal, and many African Americans were often treated very rudely. Many protests went on during this time and led to more important events that shaped the United States of America. When the Jim Crow laws were made, people started to believe the doctrine of separate but equal. This doctrine was strongly believed in until African Americans began to stand up for their rights. The African Americans would hold walks and marches to stand up to the Jim Crow laws. The African Americans had argued that the 14th Amendment should make every opportunity the same for white man and an African American. The 14th Amendment is as follows: no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Many African American schools were in rough shape, and some had only one room with two teachers, while the white-only schools had better conditions, more money, and had more teachers. In Topeka, Kansas, there was a young girl named Linda Brown who went to a segregated school. Linda Brown was going to attend an all-black Monroe Elementary School. Linda was only 5 at the time. Linda had many friends who would be going to a nearby summer school, which was an all-white school. Linda was very confused about why she would have to travel almost 8 miles when an all-white school was very close by. "Why can't I go to school with all the other kids?" she asked. With heartbreak, her dad explained about school segregation and the color of her skin. Monroe Elementary was a small school, and Linda Brown would have to walk 6 miles to catch a bus that would drive her 2 miles to her school. In an interview from Washington University, Linda described her walk. It was several blocks up through railroad yards and crossing a busy avenue, and standing on the corner and waiting for the bus to carry me 2 miles across town to an all-black school. Linda also explains, "I began to cry because it was so cold, and many times I had to turn around and run back home." Oliver Brown, who was Linda's father, was very upset by Linda having to make the treacherous journey every day. But unlike his fellow African American neighbors, Brown decided to do something. Oliver Brown enrolled his daughter in an all-white school and continued to fight for her rights when she was denied admission. Brown versus the Board of Education broke barriers for many African American students in their fight against school segregation. Oliver Brown was the assistant pastor at Topeka's African American Methodist Church, as well as being a welder for the nearby railway. Oliver Brown testified on Linda's behalf because he thought it was wrong for Linda to make the treacherous travel to her school. The Brown family knew that segregation was wrong, but they didn't know what they could do. Oliver Brown decided to try and enroll Linda into the all-white summer school. Oliver Brown went to the principal of the summer school, but he said, "It isn't my policy, Mr. Brown. Segregation is the policy of the school board, and I have to abide by their decision." The principal had no choice but to deny Linda. He didn't want to fight the school board for the sake of his job. Oliver and Linda went home and later enrolled Linda into the African American segregated school. Over the backyard fence, Oliver would talk to his white neighbor about the school situation. "I don't understand why it's like this," the young woman told Mr. Brown. "We've lived together in peace and harmony. A child is a child." Mr. and Mrs. Brown thought over this issue for 3 years before they decided to try again and go to the summer school and apply. Mr. Brown tried again, but he had the same result as before. The Supreme Court took Brown versus the Board of Education and combined it with 4 other cases and called it Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Thurgood Marshall was the chief attorney for Oliver Brown and the 4 other families. The main defense was an equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment. The case continued because all 9 of the justices disagreed with each other. It was May 17, 1954, the day that would change the outlook on segregation in schools. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka was the first step in the desegregation of America's schools. Chief Justice Earl Warren issued the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, ruling that racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The NAACP's legal defense profile explained that the verdict occurred only after a hard-fought multi-year campaign to persuade all 9 justices to overturn the separate but equal doctrine that their predecessors had endorsed in the court's infamous 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision. The biggest outcome of the case was that students of color in America would no longer be forced by law to attend traditionally under-resourced black-only schools. The Supreme Court ruled that the word separate truly meant unequal. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka was a turning point in breaking the barrier of segregation. Not only was segregation happening in Topeka, but it was happening all over the country. The case did not directly stop segregation in America's schools, but it fueled the fire of the civil rights movement. By overturning the separate but equal doctrine, a legal precedent was set for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had realized that some of their past decisions weren't always the best interest for all the people of the United States. After Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was soon made. Following this act was Voting Rights Act of 1964 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Supreme Court also told the school boards of America to proceed on desegregation. The gap between the 2 groups of children statistically dropped more than 1/4% of what it was. Also, integrated classrooms encouraged the students to think more creatively, critical thinking, and problem solving. The students in these classrooms will now have to think about what will benefit everyone, not just the white students or the African American students.